Now, so hello everybody, welcome and good evening. My name is Ben Worthy, and I am currently the director of the Centre for British Political Life here at Birkbeck. When I arrived at Birkbeck long ago in 2010, and when I took over the centre later on, I was both immensely proud and a little bit scared to be taking over from so many luminaries, such as Professor Joni Lovenduski, Professor Rosie Campbell, and Professor Sarah Childs. So, with that intro, I want to welcome you to this third event of Birkbeck Politics at 50, and one that I've been looking forward to ever since we first arranged it back in 2021. With us this evening, we have Professor Joni Lovenduski. I've put some biographical details there in the chat for you to have a read, but Joni was a professor at Birkbeck between 2000 and 2016. She's also the founder of the very centre over which this event is being done. Before that, she was at Southampton and Loughborough, and originally studied at Manchester, though she actually hails originally from New Jersey. Joni played a crucial role. If everyone can just switch off their mics, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Joni played a crucial role, as EPR put it, in their Lifetime Achievement Award in defining and determining the field of gender and politics within political science. Her books include a series of landmark defining texts, which you're probably familiar with, including a very famous book with Pippa Norris in the 1990s on political recruitment, and another equally as famous book on feminizing politics in 2005. I am going to try and list some of our accolades, but we probably need a separate event for that. She's a fellow of the British Academy, a recipient of the Isaiah Berlin Prize for Lifetime Achievement, and very recently has been made a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. If somebody could just switch off their mic, please, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so she was recently made a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. One of the things that always really impressed me about Joni when I got to Birkbeck was also not only was she very important as a political scientist, but also had a real practical effect on the development of British politics. She was very influential in the Speakers' Conference on parliamentary representation in 2008. And also very, very influential in the development of things like quotas in British politics. So with her tonight in conversation is Professor Rosie Campbell, also lately of the parish of Birkbeck, but now is the director of the Institute for Women's Leadership at King's. She's an expert in political participation, gender and voting, and also has done a series of cutting-edge experiments, as well as a huge project looking at political candidates. I think I'm actually talking myself out of speaking any further now, given we have such eminent speakers. So I am going to stop speaking now. I'm going to hand over to Rosie, who's going to start a conversation with Joni. Meantime, I'm going to monitor the chat for any of your questions and thoughts, and then we'll try and end with a few questions for Joni from you yourself. So as we go along, if you can just post any questions in the chat and try and keep your mics off, that would be absolutely wonderful. Without any further ado, over to you, Professors Rosie Campbell and Professors Joni Lovenduski.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that very warm welcome. And this is also a very exciting opportunity for me because I have been following Joni around for a very long time. Joni taught me as an undergraduate at Southampton and then encouraged me to apply for funding for a master's at Southampton. And then when I started my PhD under her supervision with Peter John, I followed her to Birkbeck and stayed there beyond when she had retired. So and Joni now is also, as well as being emeritus at Birkbeck, a visiting professor at King's working with me. So Joni has not yet escaped my clutches, and I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation with you, Joni. So let's go back to the beginning of your academic career. You didn't start out studying gender, did you?
Well, it's actually more complicated than that. And thank you, Ben, and thank you, Rosie, for such lovely introductions. And thank you. It is very nice to see so many of my former colleagues at Birkbeck floating past in this event. I actually started university as a student of English and American literature in the United States. And I went to do my junior year abroad in the English department at Manchester. And after an interruption, I somehow or other ended up in the government department at Manchester. I think I wanted to be an accountant because I thought it was a very good way of earning a living. And I drifted away from accountancy when I realized that the exams, I would only actually get out of 3 months worth of training and examination if I did the whole degree in accountancy. So I switched to government, where I'd been, very, very influenced by Sammy Finer's first year lectures. And gradually, I came to the attention of Sammy Finer, who was the head of the department, and Gita Ionescu, who taught in the Manchester department at that time. And they encouraged me to go on. And I was interested in comparative politics. And in order to get funding, I had to say, I don't think I've ever really confessed this before, at least not for a very long time. In order to get funding, I had to undertake a project in Polish local government. And that kind of eventually morphed into a master's thesis on Rosa Luxemburg. And that morphed into, many, many years later, a book on comparative East European politics that I wrote with Jean Woodall. So we were in the really terrific position of publishing that book just before the wall came down and everything changed. And we were amongst the dozens of East European specialists who did not predict a single moment of what happened later. So that book is not, although I quite like it still, that book is not on the long list of prize-winning publications. So I started out really as a comparative politics person, and I mainly taught comparative politics, and gradually started to become interested in feminism because it was in the air. And someone advised me that I was so much more interested and interesting when I spoke about feminism and politics that maybe I ought to just transfer my affections to that. So I did.
Well, I'm very glad indeed you did, and that you were not taken to promise to get accountancy. I feel like you might have missed a little bit along the journey, that you've just, the truncated version that you've just given us. What was it about? I mean, it was in the air, but what was it about gender and politics that really, really motivated you?
Well, at the time, I just couldn't find anything to read about gender that really addressed politics in any systematic way. I couldn't, there was a lot of feminist writing that had a concept of power, but there really wasn't very much knowledge about how institutions worked and how different institutions might help and so forth and so on. Now, all of that changed quite quickly. First in the United States, when the Women's Caucus of the American Political Science Association was founded, and then later in Europe, when we founded other organizations. I think what attracted me was really quite simple, that I identified with it. I could see that so-called representative institutions and so-called democratic institutions seem to be almost entirely populated by men. And I could see that various interests that women had just weren't considered to be legitimate political interests. And all of that meant that I was a highly motivated feminist political scientist. I never pretended to be neutral.
And how easy was it persuading your comparative politics colleagues to take your work and these ideas seriously?
I think it was a complete failure, really, for years. They were perfectly prepared to indulge me, and gradually with a number of other women, feminist political scientists who were interested, we founded an organization within the Political Studies Association, and we actually then took that, or I and a few other people took that to the European Consortium for Political Research. And we got some attention. There was a lot of press attention at that time to feminism, and somehow or other, we managed to convince the senior colleagues in the profession. We managed to convince them that we were much more powerful and to be worried about than we actually were. I mean, for example, we'd have very early breakfast meetings, which everybody hated, but it really scared the men to know that we were doing it. There were those kinds of tactics.
I mean, you've told me some stories over the years that you probably would prefer not to repeat in a recorded forum, but perhaps you can share some of the more socially acceptable ones about some of the reactions that your colleagues had about incorporating feminism. I'm particularly thinking about the case of Switzerland.
Well, that was very early on. I was an undergraduate at Manchester, and I wasn't really thinking in this way at that time. But somebody put an exam question or a seminar question, I think, on our list that was basically something along the lines of, why is it that Switzerland does not allow women to vote and it's still democratic? And I thought, hello. I was in a seminar, a tutorial of about 7 or 8 people. I was the only woman, and I just thought, well, actually, if women haven't got the vote, it isn't democratic. And I was just treated as though I was borderline insane for even beginning to argue this. And I kept up the argument for the whole of the seminar hour, but I don't think I convinced anyone.
I think that's just such a striking example. I use it often to try and explain what you've described, the way things were in terms of trying to shift the discipline at that time. That really, it was long before Hillary Clinton and human rights are women's rights. You've also you've given us a brief example of how you organised, and it's something that anyone who's worked knows very, very well. That as well as doing the first class scholarship, actually you're doing a lot of institution building and collaboration and behind the scenes dealing with difficult problems. You're very good at dealing with difficult problems. How did that develop? How did that strategic part of your career develop?
I think every time I achieved what I wanted to achieve, I kind of looked over the parapet and could see something else to do. I don't think there was a big plan. I really don't, to this day, don't really understand why I'm thought to be strategic.
Well, anyone who's worked with you has a very clear idea, where all the moving pieces are and what everyone's motivations and intentions are, and how to organise to collectively to make what you want to happen. That must be an intrinsic skill rather than one you've developed then, or at least consciously. It's possible.
I think the thing about organization is it's persuading people to go along with something that you think it's a good idea to do, and being really good at ignoring the places where you disagree.
Well, I mean, you've got that down to a fine art, I have to say. So let's speed forward a little bit and talk about Birkbeck and how you came to arrive at Birkbeck.
Well, by the time I arrived at Birkbeck, which was in the last part of my career, I already knew that I wanted to work there, and a job came up and I applied for it. And after quite a lot of toing and froing, I was offered the job and I accepted it. And I wanted to go to the department, partly because as someone who had been a mature student, I had 2 goes at university, and the second time it actually took. As someone who had been a mature student, I actually believed in the Birkbeck mission. But I was also very attracted to the department as it was then. It was radical, it was progressive, it was intellectually extremely inviting and stimulating. I mean, when I arrived, Paul Hurst was still there, Sammy was there, Sammy Zubaida was there, Bill Thompson, who I still see and talk to, was there. And I met a whole bunch of younger colleagues at the same time, and it just felt like something that was a good fit for me.
I think Sammy's on this call. I think I saw Sammy's name come up. But could you tell us a bit of what it was like to be in a department with Paul and Sammy?
Well, it was very stimulating, as I said. It also involved quite a lot of very good food, some extremely entertaining evenings. We had an annual research meeting as a department that would usually involve Sammy cooking for us wonderful food at his flat, and often involved certainly me having drunk so much that I couldn't persuade a taxi to come and get me. So they were jolly times, but they were also interesting. I mean, there was no problem with my attitudes and my politics and my interests and fitting in, which had been a problem in other institutions.
I mean, one thing that struck me, because I joined the department in 2003, and if I think back on it now compared to what it was like then, or what academia is like compared to what it was like then, I remember in meetings we actually took collective decisions. You could raise your hand and take it. And it was an incredibly collaborative environment, wasn't it?
I think so. I thought so at the time. I still think so. That's how I remember it. It also was. I think we had certainly in the early days we had an awful lot of agreement on the fundamentals, and the whole system was less bureaucratized. So, for example, if you made an appointment, you had an enormous amount of access to getting information about who the candidates were and so forth. All of that's much more restricted now.
Yeah, it's a very different environment in my experience, academia now, and perhaps Birkbeck has still retained more of that individuality. So at the time, one of the things we want to reflect back on, as well as your time at Birkbeck in your own career, is what's changed for women in politics over the time. So when you came to Birkbeck and you were now working in London, what was it like for women in politics at that time?
Well, it was the beginning of the second Labour government, so there was a sense in which people had got used to the idea that there would be more women in politics. And I don't know if you remember, but the second Labour government, the number of women or the proportion of women went down slightly. And that gave quite a lot of strength to arguments for bringing in or resuming, in fact, some kind of quotas. And gradually, over time, the Labour Party became much more committed to doing that, and it still is. So there was an acceptance, I think, that this was, if not a legitimate demand, then certainly a demand that was probably going to, a demand by women to be included, that was probably going to be met. And so people who had expertise on it were routinely questioned, asked to give evidence, interviewed by the press, and so forth and so on. That is a really significant change from 15 years, 20 years earlier, when you could barely state the problem of women's underrepresentation. It was also pretty hard. It was also pretty hard to explain it. Now it seems that we know all these things. I mean, one of the things that I think about then and now is that I don't think these gains that women have made are secure. And I've never particularly thought that the gains were secure, but now it just seems to me to be very much in the air, that there's a great deal of resistance, possibly not so much to women's presence, but to women's effectiveness and women's effectiveness on behalf of other women.
I'm thinking back to, I'll return to the state of politics now, but I'm thinking back to that time. You did some fantastic work with Bonnie Soames that I remember that got a lot of media attention. What kind of things were you revealing in that work?
Well, what we were revealing, and it wasn't the first time we'd revealed it, or people had revealed it, what we were revealing was that Parliament was an incredibly sexist environment in which in which women, and particularly the new Labour women MPs, were treated to an unbelievable amount of sexual harassment. So we published a book, and we did a few interviews, and suddenly, I mean, I remember that the Birkbeck switchboard, you know, just got completely blocked. I didn't really know this was going on. I was sitting in my office waiting to teach, and it was a shock. You know, it's the great, you know, Westminster is awash with sex pest shock. And that's happened 4 or 5 times since, you know, and everybody's still shocked each time they find out that the place is absolutely crawling with people who do quite a lot of sexual harassment. And that's at best. It doesn't mean that everybody does it, but it does mean that there's something in the environment that permits it and makes it very, very difficult to stop. And it also makes it very difficult. It's also surprises me how difficult it is to keep it on the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, it's appalling to me that this story seems to be on a cyclical trend, that we have every couple of years a massive outrage and then very little change. I can see we've got Sarah Childs on the call, who also knows a lot about reforming Parliament. We'll see if she can share any questions. So going back to your own work, I'm thinking about you. I know that you've been reassessing much of the work that you've done over the years, and I'm just thinking one example is Political Recruitment, the very influential book that you wrote with Pippa Norris, that really set the standard for the whole field and is still the kind of the key tome to this day. How do you feel about that work when you look back on it now?
Well, first of all, I should say that it was a very enjoyable project to design. We had an awful lot of fun designing it and trying to make it work, and it was a multi-method project that involved us getting the cooperation of the political parties and going to party selection meetings. And we actually had different costumes for different political parties. I kept them in my car and would change shoes, and I had red boots for Labour Party selections and blue pumps for Conservative Party selections and so forth. It was, you know, it was enjoyable. It was, I think, the notion of looking at selectors, voters, candidates, and politicians in a stratified way was an extremely novel way of doing it. Nobody had done that before. Now it seems more obvious, and of course it seemed obvious to us at the time, which is why we made the proposal. When I look back on it, I like the way it went. I'm surprised by how successful it turned out to be and how influential. And I think always about what we didn't do. So one of the things that has struck me recently was we didn't really look at all, although it's kind of blindingly obvious that it's a part of it, is how the recruitment process socializes candidates into people who can function at Westminster. Just going through that whole step-by-step process turns a candidate into somebody else. And I think that's one of the points that I was trying to get at when I was writing later about why we expect the things we expect from women in politics. We expect too much, really. So it was also, and this is kind of geek speak, but it was also a very early attempt, not particularly conscious, at a feminist institutionalist study of a particular institution and process. And I think had we been more explicitly feminist institutionalists, we could have done better. It would have been better. So I have mixed feelings about it. I'm glad to have done it. It was not something I would particularly want to do again, particularly the, you know, hanging out in the middle of constituency selection meetings. I mean, one occupational hazard of studying political recruitment is you always get invited to be a candidate. And one of the things that you learn when you study recruitment really closely is that you don't want to be a candidate, and it's quite a tricky balance to deal with that particular experience.
I don't think in the UK anyone has. Jeanette Ash, our former PhD student, has looked at selections inside the Labour Party, but nobody has done a systematic study across the parties looking at aspirant candidates who were unsuccessful in the way that you did. And I know various of us have tried to get funding to do it because it's such an important part of, the filtration process. But that, nobody's managed to replicate that as yet. And it's a really important piece of work that I think really needs doing. So taking on from that, looking back on your career so far, because there's more to do, but looking back on your career so far, which parts did you enjoy the most?
Well, that's very good. That's a very good question. And I've actually, because I knew you were going to ask it, I've actually been thinking about it quite a lot. I think I enjoyed, one of the things I enjoyed the most, and I'm not saying this just because I'm here, as it were, was teaching Birkbeck students. I mean, they were consistently pretty stimulating, and I could absolutely guarantee, especially in my British politics courses, that there would be at least one and probably more people in the room who knew more about what I was talking about than I did. And that is quite a nice position to be in as an academic. And I don't think it's possible to reproduce it in any other institution. It was absolutely wonderful, really, and eye-opening. I enjoyed research design. I enjoyed my colleagues. I wouldn't say I enjoyed, well, there are a number of things I didn't enjoy, but I think that maybe is a wholly other question. But no, basically, I think in the end, it was the interaction with people with ideas who wanted to express them that I particularly liked.
Have to say, I relate to the point you've made about Birkbeck students. I remember my very first class that I was teaching, and having very, very senior civil servants and a former economics academic in my classroom, and learning very, very quickly. I had to say, I'm coming with the knowledge of this very specific piece of literature, and you are coming with all of this other knowledge, and together the mix is going to be absolutely fantastic. But yes, it's a good steep learning curve teaching Birkbeck students, but incredibly rewarding. What did you not enjoy quite so much?
I grew to loathe and detest the research assessment exercises. I thought something that started out as quite a good idea to get rid of, what were essentially bloated one-man band barren departments that had been typical, in which people's research wasn't encouraged. And remember, in those days anyway, the government was paying for people to do research as well as teaching. There were, it did have the effect originally of turning a spotlight on some of the very unfortunate practices from that were around when I started. But it turned into a muscle-bound, bureaucratic, expensive, time-consuming, time-wasting exercise that I don't think does anything for anybody. And I'm waiting for this whole system to short because I've said that.
I mean, I have to say, when I was talking about the increasing bureaucracy in universities, I do wonder whether colleagues, you mentioned Paul Hurst, you mentioned Sammy, the colleagues who had, such a rounded interdisciplinary view and understanding, the REF really pushes us down a very narrow path, and in that way, it's incredibly destructive in the longer term, I think. So I agree with you that it's although it might have served a purpose originally, at this point perhaps it's no longer a force for good really in any sense.
No, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that it made me think, reflecting on it, is that it's part of a whole process which you can see in academic publishing, and you can see in promotion processes and so forth. It encourages fast science, and fast science for me in this sense is the equivalent of fast food. It isn't particularly satisfying, it isn't particularly nutritional, it simply does the job, ticks the boxes, sends somebody out probably overfed and bloated, but not any much the wiser. And I think it's a really severely unfortunate pressure.
I agree. I've just received a text message from Sarah Charles. I don't know how to raise a question in the chat, so I don't know if others are having that problem. When I close my questions, perhaps Ben can share how to do that. So if you could go back and offer yourself one tip at the start of your career, what would it be?
Well, I think I'd offer myself two. One is that there is absolutely no point in fudging anything in order to make people like you, because it won't work. You might as well do what you honestly want to do and accept the consequences, some of which will be respect. And the other thing is that nobody ever gets remembered for perfect administration.
Well, that's very sound advice, I would suggest. So in your career, as well as politics, you've also really reflected on academia. What do you think that the biggest obstacles are remaining to women academics?
Well, to women academics, I think there are still significant biases against women in certain subfields. Some aspects of political science and especially political theory have got much better, but there is still bias. There's still bias against women for sure. I think for all academics, the way in which the job has changed, the movement really from some autonomy to less autonomy, the movement to more constrained requirements about what you think and do, the notion of what academic work actually consists of, I think that's changed. I remember very, very early on, before the research assessment exercises ever began, but when people were trying to think about how to make assessments, somebody did a survey, it might have even been me, but somebody did a survey asking academics in the Political Studies Association how many hours of work they did a week. And Brian Barry got very upset. Brian Barry was a very famous professor of political theory. He got very upset because he didn't understand whether the question intended him to include the time he spent in the morning thinking about things and reading the newspaper and following events. And I think in politics, that's actually pretty telling, that I sometimes do, because I sometimes do consultancy work, I include thinking time, but we're very seldom given credit for our thinking time.
And it's very hard to do any good work without it, isn't it? What about women politicians? What barriers are remaining for women politicians?
Well, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. I mean, there are some countries in the world where women can barely get elected to politics, but in places, in most European countries, there are structures of encouragement for women in politics. The problem really is what happens to them when they get there, and what they have to give up in order to get there. And one of the things I used to think that they had to give up was being women. Really, in order to be a politician, you had to turn into a man. And I'm not sure that still isn't true.
So, I mean, there are more women who are mothers in Parliament and have more children who are younger, but you still think there's a pressure to conform to a male stereotype.
I think there is I mean, men have children too, and I think there is a pressure to conform to a male stereotype. I think there's also a pressure to there's a pressure to be involved and play a role in some issues, to do with many of those issues that are to do with maternity, women's rights, childcare, and so forth, while at the same time having to succeed in the already determined masculinized world of foreign policy, the economy, and so forth. And there are pressures against that. But I think the other thing, it's very hard to say this because, of course, I'm not a woman politician, and I don't go out in the world and experience it. I can only do what everybody else does and listen to what people tell me and read the papers and so forth. But looking at the way in which women politicians are treated in public, even in public, the amount of misogyny is quite extraordinary. And I was thinking, I don't know if you noticed all of those kind of male chests being powdered at the G7, those photographs of casual men, and one extremely proper and unrelaxed looking Ursula von der Leyen standing at the end. And I mean, that's probably the least of it.
Yeah, I mean, my point about children was thinking about the work that I did with Sarah that showed that for previous generations of women politicians less often had children than men, and if they did have them, they tended to enter parliament when they're a bit older and they had fewer of them, and that has changed somewhat. But to me, the real horror is thinking, I felt at the beginning of doing this kind of research under your supervision, that things were getting better. We were heading in a positive direction, and I think if you look at the kind of the violent threats that many women politicians and some men, and especially ethnic minority women politicians, receive as standard weekly, I don't think we would have anticipated that 20 years ago. And it's I think your point about these gains not necessarily being secure, to me, that's really been brought home by recent revelations of the way things are in Westminster.
Well, not just Westminster. Washington isn't looking that cool, nor are quite a number of other places. I mean, in fact, when we did the political recruitment research, which we did in the mid 1990s, early to mid 1990s, one of the things that we discovered in our interviews, and particularly with women who were interested in coming forward in their seat selection and so forth, was that they were completely anxious and worried and put off by the way they would be treated in the press and how it would affect their children and so forth. So far from going for local constituencies, they tried to go for non-local constituencies so the family at home wouldn't suffer too much from the way in which the press were going to treat them. And I mean, these were real fears, and they were real fears that were backed up by examples. Now, there seems to me, and I have no idea if this is any more than an impression, there seems to me to be much more overt threat of absolute violence to women politicians, both in the workplace and in their constituencies.
Absolutely. There's a question in the chat from Sam about the current state of American politics, but I'm going to let her bring that to you when we close our conversation. But that you were touching on beyond the UK there. So to quote a title of yours from 2015, is political science still worthwhile for feminists in your view?
Well, I think so, insofar as it is concerned with assessing evidence and maintaining standards of validity and reliability. It gives us a terrific weapon for outlining the state of play, measuring progress, measuring fallback, and so forth. It also used to, may not still, for very much longer anyway, it also prioritizes ideas about rights and democracy that are built into institutions in various ways and encourages their assessment. And all of those are pretty useful resources.
Indeed. So, I mean, I know some of the answer to this because you're supporting the work that I'm doing at the moment, but what's your next project?
Well, my next project is a little bit ephemeral at the moment because I've been pretty shocked by some of the things I've been watching in the news. Really, I'm horrified by how fragile our democracies have become. I'm not confident that they're going to persist in recognizable form. I was totally knocked out by Roe v. Wade, not because it wasn't predicted, but because overturning it was, ultimately such a savage piece of institutional manipulation. It was a long-term project that worked. And I can see no reason why these guys aren't going to continue to produce the same sort of policies. I was horrified by the latest manifestations of the Westminster sex pest problem, not least for the reasons that we just suggested, is that this just keeps happening. I was pretty shocked by the travesty of justice that the Depp Heard trial in the United States turned out to be. And I'm pretty unhappy, really, and depressed about the way in which the police treated people demonstrating about the Sarah Everard murder by a policeman. All of these things seem to me to show up contradictions about the place that the insecurity, really, of the place that women have gained. I mean, if you think about the American Supreme Court, well, somebody pointed out somewhere that all they had to do was go back, just over 100 years, and they can remove the right to vote. We can look at Afghanistan and see precisely that. So I have this terrible problem when I get into these things about this, because the encouragement is always to say you must find causes for optimism, and I don't find it very easy.
No, but I suppose I can bring my last question in to bear on this problem, that I would think almost all students of comparative politics everywhere share your concerns, and suddenly this work feels even more important than perhaps it did. What's the one thing you would say to someone they ought to read to really help them think about what's happening? And even if it's not going to give you a cause for optimism, it will be useful.
I can't answer that question very well. I looked at it, I thought about it, and the things that really influenced me won't be so resonant today. So I have a big problem with it. So I decided that I was going to fudge it and say these are things that influence me. And a book, it's a very old book now, but I believe it's still in print, that influenced me enormously, is a book called Politics and Vision by Sheldon Walden. And another book that influenced me, and probably you, was Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And the book that got me interested in politics in the first place was a book, I don't know if people even still read it, about the First World War, called All Quiet on the Western Front, which I think everybody should read.
Those are very good suggestions. Thank you, Joni. Well, that's the end of my questions, and I know that Ben has been collecting up the questions from the chat. So I'm going to hand over to. Oh, Jason's asking, can you give us some hope? Joni, can you?
Joni, maybe I was just going to jump in there, because that was going to be the kind of tenor of my question. There's been lots of really interesting questions in the chat, and I'm sorry if I don't get through all of them, so I'm just going to cultivate a couple of the ones that kind of pick up on themes which I think people most be interested in hearing the time we've got left. So I wanted to jump back actually to Sam's first question, which is about Roe v. Wade, and maybe combine it with Jason's question. Is there any kind of grounds for hope, or are we all kind of delusional in the sort of Martin Luther King bending towards justice?
You mean the arc of history bends towards justice? It's having a little hiccup at the moment, isn't it? The kinds of encouragement that you can see in the United States around the Roe v. Wade decision are a mobilization of helpers, of people who want to change that politics, and I suppose that's encouraging. The statement by the governor of California, now I believe other governors, that abortion and reproductive rights are safe in certain states, is encouraging. My Cassandra-like take on the longer view, though, is that I don't actually see the Trump supporting Middle Western, vast, overwhelming territorial majority, if not the popular majority, of gun-toting Trump supporters. I don't really see them stopping. I see them as continuing to pursue their agendas, and to use the institutions that they've captured very effectively to do that. Is it possible to unmake that? Well, you can look at and this really isn't quite my area of expertise, but if you look at American history, you can see times when the United States has been in pretty bad shape, and not all of those times led to the Civil War, but so it has recovered, but I honestly don't see at the moment what the mechanism will be, unless it's outrage at Roe v. Wade itself, and the Constitution is so configured that that outrage may not be able to find popular expression.
Thanks, Johnny. I know it's difficult to talk about because, as you said, it was kind of, we knew it was going to happen, but also it's a huge shock simultaneously. I was going to pick up on a question from Sarah Childs, which is a really good question, maybe to reflect on the sort of entirety of your career so far, which is, how responsive has political science been to feminist political science, and how has that kind of altered over time?
Well, I think it has been, some of it's been responsive. I think there's certain aspects of legislative studies, political representation, and political theory more generally, where there's been quite an interest in the ideas, and there's been some quite reflective considerations of what has been done. Now, in terms of change over time, well, when I first started doing this, one of the big problems of recruiting people for our organizations was that they may very well have been doing research in their PhDs on gender and politics, but their supervisors were telling them that they would never get a job if they continued that. And a lot of them just didn't stay. So that, many of the people who were around in the early days either didn't get jobs because they did continue that, or went off and did something else. Now, I think it is completely possible to have these questions about representation, and actually much broader questions, not just about particular groups of women, but the whole question of diversity, of intersectionality, and so forth. Now it's possible to make a career within the university sector studying these, and it's also possible to make a career acting these particularly in the third sector, but also in some areas of politics. I'm reluctant to say in some areas of the civil service these days, but there are, there's a market for feminist political science that there didn't used to be. So that's changed. I mean, in terms of responsiveness, there's intellectual responsiveness, which takes on board the ideas, and I regard responding intellectually to some kind of challenge as taking on the ideas and changing my own ideas in some measure as a result of taking them on. Now, there's been some of that, but there's also been absolute resistance, and then there's a broad intermediate category of people who simply use sex as a background variable, and every now and again genuflect to the ideas about women's political representation, but you'd never catch them thinking about it in the first place.
That's really interesting. So I was going to follow up with a question from Ianthe, my PhD student, to actually build on this. And she's interested in, what do you see as the really important future trends for research around gender and politics? So what do you think are the things that over the next 10 years or so are going to be really important?
Well, one thing that I would very much like to see researched, and I think it is going to be important, I think it's already becoming important, I'd like to see a lot more work on the relationship between policy ideas and policy outcomes in terms of equality policy. And this would be research that took diversity into account, but there's really in the equality policy world, there's been a tendency to say, okay, we got our law passed, and not actually check and see whether anybody ever got more equal as a result of it. So I think that's one big thing that's going to happen. I think another thing that will get to be better and better done, partly because of ways of using data and artificial intelligence and so forth, is going to be demonstrations of bias and misogyny. and how it operates against women. And another area, and I'm just not really very sure about this, I haven't thought it through very carefully, but I think the huge divisions in gender equality movements are very poorly understood. And sooner or later, researchers are going to start to make some sort of serious attempt to understand them.
That's really interesting. I wonder if I could just pick up on a question there, actually, because one of the things I find as an academic, and I don't know if you feel the same, is that we're always having lots of ideas for projects, and we probably do 1 in 10 of the projects that we think about. Are there any particular projects that you always wanted to do, or you put to one side to revisit one day, that you always think about and kind of never let go of? Is there any of the kind of, are there any Lovenduski books that never got written that you'd still like to read or revisit?
Oh, well, yeah, there are. There's one in particular, and it's about, do equality policies make people more equal? So
this is the kind of measurement of the law. This is the measurement. Did it really make a difference?
Yeah. How can you tell? Did it make a difference? How can you tell it made a difference? How can you be sure it was that and not something else? Those all the questions that go with that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And everybody take note. That's the next book we want to read from you, Joni. There's a very specific question about British politics from Joe Irvin here, and he was interested in
Joe.
What your views were on the Labour Party dropping all women shortlists.
Well, I think I've heard somebody say this even this week. I wish we didn't need quotas, but we still do, and I'm just not sure. You could argue that everything is now so carefully and beautifully underway in the Labour Party that it will just continue, and you don't need quotas to continue it. Or you could look very closely at who's selecting. Well, if you look at Jeanette Ash's work, she shows very clearly that women tend to get selected for women-only shortlist seats, and they don't get selected for those that aren't, because they're considered to be taken care of. Now, you might take the view that the absence of quotas, the experience of seats where there aren't quotas, will be the experience of not having quotas.
Okay. And a penultimate question in the chat from another Birkbeck member of staff, from Laura. And this is something said by Boris Johnson, but I confess that within it there is, rather unbelievably, a serious point. What do you think of his comment that Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if Putin was a woman?
I have no idea. I mean, what if he'd been Margaret Thatcher?
That's just about, I think, the best answer you can give. Chow Yo's also picked up on your comment there about the ref and fast science, and maybe we can kind of have this question to close. I once gave you a piece that I was working on, and you were sat in the chair looking very thoughtful when I walked in the room, and you told me that I shouldn't spray on theory onto something that needs to be used properly. So I noticed on the chat we've got a huge variety of academics, lots of Birkbeck staff, lots of friends and colleagues, and it's really wonderful that you're all here. But we've got quite a few early career researchers. Do you have any tips or advice for them now? Are there any kind of golden nuggets that you could perhaps pass on to them to help them? What would you tell them? And maybe even imagine if you're going back and telling yourself something at the start of your career.
I think the thing that I would probably say first of all isn't subject specific, which is to devote as much time and attention as you possibly can to writing well.
And are there any particular writers you'd recommend, or is it a particular style, or do you just mean kind of hone the skill of editing and writing?
No, I mean, I think and I'm as guilty of this as any other aspiring academic. I think that if it's possible, if it's worth saying, it's possible to say it without jargon. And
Yeah.
there are plenty of people who do this very, very well. And somebody I think is particularly good at it is Anne Phillips. So she's, I think, a really seriously good writer. I think that hiding behind jargon is something that we do when we're not sure of ourselves, and we think it makes us look more scientific. It may be that we're struggling with our own confusions and lack of clarity. But I do think it's probably more important than almost anything else to be able to say in a way that you can be understood what it is you're trying to say. And that probably, and if you find yourself spending an awful lot of pages explaining what you mean by such and such a term, I think you're probably not doing it right.
And do you, as a writer, find that it gets easier over time, or do you constantly practice, or is editing the key part, as I sometimes tell my students?
One of the things I find when I'm writing is that the ideas flow when I'm writing, which is kind of a pain, because if you sit down and write one idea and and others come charging in, it confuses things. I suppose that would be my other piece of advice, is to write as often as you can, even if you can only manage 50 words.
And do you manage to write 50 words a day or so? Is that a target?
Well, sitting here in the middle of Italy in a heat wave, no.
Oh, that's really wonderful.
But when I am in writing mode, I really do try, even if I end up tearing it up. I really do try to do something almost every day, and I think it helps. I think it helps you to be clear. I think it gives you something to go on, even if it's a mess when you come back to it, and so forth.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I think it took me far longer than it should have done to realize what you just said there, which is that writing is also thinking. And you often kind of believe that you can think before you start writing, but actually the writing process itself is a kind of way of thinking and organizing your thoughts and giving you clarity. Well, Joni, it's been really, really wonderful. It's been so interesting. We seem to have covered so much ground. We've had a great response from all these questions, and I realize we've thrown all sorts of different questions at you in all sorts of directions. It'll be fascinating to see what you do next. We're all going to wait for your book and your project on the impact of the Equalities Act in the UK and wherever. Available in all good bookshops in the next 2 years. It's been a real privilege speaking with you, and it's been a real privilege having Rosie here with you as well, asking you such great questions. Birkbeck is extremely lucky to have you here, and if you ever fancy coming back to do another Q&A at any point, people would be absolutely delighted to have you here, either in person or online. Just to note, everybody, this event has been recorded, so you can watch it again. And tomorrow, as a follow-up to having Joni Lovenduski, we have Lisa Nandy, another Birkbeck alumni, who's going to be in conversation with me. Well, without further ado, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's listening. We've had such a great and diverse audience. I think you've seen all the different people who've been in the chat. Thank you hugely to Rosie Campbell for beaming in with such amazing questions. And thank you most of all to Professor Joni Lovenduski, who hopefully will be back again very soon to Birkbeck to talk to us again. Thank you very much, Joni, and thank you for helping us celebrate the 50th anniversary.
Thank you.